Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're going to get into something that, maybe sounds a little bit dry at first, but I promise it's really not. And that is market failures.
Yeah.
You hear about the free market and how it's supposed to be this perfect system, but what happens when it doesn't work quite right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. In a perfect world,
Mhm.
the market's like this invisible hand that guides all the resources to the best use.
Right.
But in the real world, sometimes that hand, uh, I don't know, drops the ball.
Yeah, it fumbles a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what we want to dive into today are all the different ways that the market can fumble. And we're going to see how these things aren't just like theoretical. They really affect all of our lives.
Yeah, definitely.
Like, for example, we're going to talk about how crazy high housing prices can actually make homelessness worse.
Yeah.
Or how, that used car that looks so good might actually be a total lemon because of something called information asymmetry. So get ready
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
to have your mind blown.
That's a good one.
But before we get into all of that, we should probably start by defining what a market failure actually is.
Okay, yeah. So a market failure, it happens when the free market just left alone on its own doesn't allocate resources in the best way,
Okay.
which makes society worse off.
All right, so it's not just when the economy is doing badly, it's something more specific than that.
Yeah, it's got to be something that's actually preventing the market from working as efficiently as it could.
So what does that look like when it makes society worse off?
Economists call it welfare loss,
Mm.
which sounds kind of vague, but it basically means that people are missing out on opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
goods or services, because the market isn't working efficiently.
Okay.
Like if there's not enough affordable housing,
Right.
or if pollution makes people sick, those are things that impact our well-being,
Yeah.
our quality of life.
All right, so I'm starting to see how these failures are more than just some economic problem. They actually affect people's lives.
Absolutely.
So how do these failures happen?
Well, there are 5 main ways the market can mess up. We call them the 5 horsemen of the market apocalypse.
Okay.
The first one is externalities.
Externalities.
The second is public goods.
Okay.
The third is imperfect information.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth is monopoly power. And then finally, we have factor immobility.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
But let's start with the first one, externalities.
Sure.
What are externalities?
Okay, so imagine you're having this nice, peaceful picnic in the park,
Okay.
and suddenly there's this factory nearby, and it starts spewing out all this thick smoke,
No.
right? Your whole afternoon is ruined, even though you had nothing to do with the factory's production.
Right.
That smoke, that's a negative externality. It's a cost that's imposed on somebody who's not involved in the economic activity.
So like unintended consequences, but for the economy.
Yeah, exactly. And pollution is like the classic example.
Right.
But there's lots of other ones too, like think about traffic congestion
Oh, yeah.
caused by everybody choosing to drive alone. Those drivers aren't factoring in the time that everyone else is wasting
Right.
because they're stuck in traffic with them.
Makes sense.
But then there's also the flip side, positive externalities.
Okay.
These are the benefits that spill over to other people. Like if you get a flu shot,
Mm-hmm.
that protects not just you, but also the more vulnerable people around you.
Right. That makes sense.
It's not all bad.
So externalities basically mean that the price of something doesn't always reflect the true cost or benefit to everyone.
Exactly.
Like the factory doesn't have to pay for making the air dirty,
Right.
and people who benefit from others getting flu shots don't have to pay for that.
Exactly. And that's where those graphs come in.
Oh, right, the graphs.
Yeah, economists love to use graphs to visualize these hidden costs and benefits.
Mm-hmm.
You can actually see how much society is losing or gaining because of the externality.
Cool. So what can we do about these externalities?
Well, sometimes the government steps in.
Oh, okay.
They might do things like impose taxes or regulations to discourage those negative externalities,
Okay.
like a carbon tax on polluters.
Right.
Or they might give subsidies to encourage the positive externalities,
Okay.
like funding for education or vaccinations.
Okay.
So they're trying to like nudge the market in the right direction.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've tackled externalities. What about public goods?
Okay. Public goods.
That's the second horseman, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So what makes them so special?
Well, public goods are these things that we all benefit from,
Okay.
but no one individual wants to pay for.
Uh-huh.
They have two key features. One is that they're non-excludable,
Non-excludable.
which means you can't prevent people from using them even if they don't pay.
Gotcha.
And then the second feature is that they're non-rivalrous,
Non-rivalrous.
meaning one person's use doesn't diminish their availability for other people.
Okay, so like a public park
Yeah, a public park is a good example.
Okay.
Anyone can enjoy it.
Uh,
And my picnic doesn't prevent you from having your picnic.
yeah. Another example is a lighthouse
Oh, yeah.
that guides ships at night.
Right,
You can't stop a ship from benefiting from its light,
right.
and one ship using it doesn't make it less bright for other ships.
But if nobody has to pay for it, who's going to build the lighthouse?
Exactly. That's the problem. It's
If
called the free rider problem,
the free rider problem.
and it leads to the underproduction of these essential goods.
Okay, because everyone's just hoping someone else will pick up the tab.
Right, and that's usually when the government steps in to provide these public goods.
Right.
Things like national defense streetlights, clean air,
Hmm.
or even public radio.
Right.
These are all things we wouldn't have if we just relied on the market.
All right, so we've covered externalities and public goods. What about the next market failure on our list? Imperfect information.
Ah, yes. This one's a bit sneaky.
Okay.
It happens when either the buyers or the sellers, or sometimes both, don't have all the info they need to make good decisions.
So it's like playing poker, but you can't see everyone else's cards.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that sounds dangerous.
It is like, imagine you're trying to buy a used car. Well, the seller knows way more about the car's history than you do.
Right.
This information asymmetry can lead to buyers getting ripped off, paying way too much for a lemon.
I've heard of that, the market for lemons.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of how imperfect information can distort the market.
So how do we fix that? How do we make things more fair?
Well, that's where things like government regulations come in.
Okay.
Think about things like food labeling laws that force manufacturers to list the ingredients,
Right.
or safety regulations for toys.
Uh-huh.
These rules help reduce information asymmetry and protect consumers.
It's like having a referee to make sure the game is played fairly.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about externalities, public goods, and imperfect information. What about this monopoly power? Does that mean we're playing Monopoly now?
Not quite,
Okay, good.
but it does involve a kind of game,
Oh.
the game of market domination. Monopoly power arises when a single company or a small group of companies control a large chunk of the market for a particular product or service.
So they were like the only game in town.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Think about a town with only one internet provider.
Oh, yeah.
The consumers don't have any choice. They just have to accept whatever price or service that provider offers.
Doesn't sound very fair.
No, it's not. And this lack of competition can lead to higher prices, lower quality goods and services, and even less innovation.
So monopolies really stifle the whole system.
They do. It upsets the balance that the market needs to work properly.
So how do we stop them? How do we fight the monopolies?
Well, governments often try to prevent monopolies from forming in the first place
Okay.
through antitrust laws.
Uh-huh.
And they can also regulate existing monopolies to limit their pricing power or encourage competition.
Gotcha. So it's a constant battle to keep things fair.
It is.
Okay, so far we've talked about externalities, public goods, imperfect information, and monopoly power. Now, what about that last one, factor immobility?
Ah, yes, this is a little more technical.
Hmm.
It basically refers to the difficulty of shifting resources like labor or capital from one industry to another.
Oh, okay.
It's like trying to turn a giant cargo ship on a dime.
Right.
Not very easy.
So it's not like a physical limitation. It's more about how hard it is to adapt resources for new uses.
Exactly.
Okay, can you give an example?
Sure, imagine a town where the main industry, say coal mining, shuts down.
Okay.
Now all these miners are out of work,
Right.
and they're skilled at what they do, but those skills aren't really transferable to other industries.
Oh, so they're stuck.
Yeah, pretty much they face unemployment because they can't adapt their labor quickly enough.
Wow. So this factor in mobility can really hold people back.
It can result in unemployment, underutilized resources, and slower economic growth.
So the market isn't always as quick and adaptable as we might think.
Nope, not always.
So what can be done to address this factor in mobility?
Well, governments and educational institutions can invest in retraining programs to help workers learn new skills.
Okay, that makes sense.
Also, policies that encourage labor mobility, like relocation assistance or affordable housing, can also help.
So basically making it easier for people and resources to move to where they're needed most.
Precisely.
Okay. Wow, this has been a whirlwind tour of all the ways markets can fail.
Yeah, we covered a lot.
From externalities to factor immobility, and it seems like all of these things aren't just theoretical, they actually have a real impact on our lives.
Absolutely. They affect things like housing, healthcare, the environment, and even employment.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious about something. We've talked a lot about how the government can intervene to fix these market failures.
Yeah,
But isn't there a risk that the government itself could also fail?
that's a great question, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about in our next episode.
Oh, good, because I'm a little worried now we've got all these market failures, and now we're saying the government might not even be able to fix them.
Well, it's not quite that simple. Government intervention can definitely help address these problems, but it's not a magic bullet.
Right.
There are definitely some risks and challenges involved, so we need to talk about those too.
Okay, so stay tuned, everyone. We'll be back soon to figure out this whole government intervention dilemma.
It's going to be a good one. Welcome back, deep divers. So last time we got a good overview of all the ways markets can fail, those pesky situations where the invisible hand, well, it kind of messes up.
Right.
But now I think it'd be helpful to look at some real-world examples to see how these failures actually affect our lives.
Yeah, I agree, because sometimes it feels like we're just talking about these abstract concepts.
Yeah, exactly.
But I want to see how they play out in actual situations. Like,
Right.
we talked about information asymmetry.
Well-
How does that actually affect me?
Okay, well, let's go back to that used car example.
Okay.
So you're looking for a used car online, and you find this amazing deal.
Okay.
Low mileage, great price, looks perfect in the
Gee,
picture.
sounds too good to be true.
Right, and that's the problem. How can you be sure it's not a lemon?
That's what I'm afraid of, ending up with a car that's nothing but problems.
And that's the whole issue with the market for lemons. The seller knows way more about the car's history than you do.
Obviously.
They know all the little quirks, all the potential problems.
Right.
And that creates an imbalance.
So as a buyer, I'm taking a big risk, hoping I don't get stuck with a clunker.
Exactly. And because buyers know this, they're not going to want to pay top dollar for any used car.
Right.
They're going to lowball their offers because they're afraid of hidden problems.
Makes sense.
But then this makes it hard for sellers of good used cars to get a fair price.
So it's like a vicious cycle.
Fear breeds low offers, which drives away good sellers, and then you're left with mostly lemons in the market.
Wow. So this information gap can really mess things up.
It can, and if it gets bad enough, the market can actually collapse.
Really?
Yeah, buyers become so scared of getting a lemon, they just stop buying used cars altogether.
And then nobody wins.
Exactly. And this problem isn't limited to used cars.
Oh, really?
No, think about health insurance.
Okay.
People who know they're at higher risk for health problems are more likely to buy insurance.
Uh-huh.
But healthier people might skip it because they don't think they need it.
Right. Yeah.
And this can lead to higher premiums for everyone because the insurance companies have to cover the costs of the people who are more likely to get sick.
So this information asymmetry, it's everywhere.
It is. It pops up in all sorts of markets.
So what can we do about it? Can we level the playing field somehow?
Absolutely. There are a few ways to tackle this problem.
Oh.
One is government regulation,
Okay.
like mandatory vehicle inspections for used cars,
Right.
or laws that require sellers to disclose any known defects.
So the government steps in to make sure everybody's playing by the rules.
Exactly. It's like having a referee to ensure fair play.
I like that.
Another solution is third-party verification services.
Oh, like what?
Well, like Carfax, for example. They provide vehicle history reports, so buyers can get more information about a car's past.
It's helpful.
Or online review platforms like Yelp, where people share their experiences to help inform other potential buyers.
So it's all about increasing transparency, giving people the information they need to make good decisions.
Exactly. And as technology gets better, we're seeing even more innovative solutions, like blockchain technology.
Blockchain, huh?
Yeah. It can be used to create secure and transparent records of like a car's maintenance history or a product's supply chain.
That's pretty cool.
It helps build trust by reducing information asymmetry.
I'm starting to see how this all connects now, but what about those other market failures we talked about, like externalities?
Sure.
We talked about pollution, but what are some other examples of externalities that we might encounter every day?
Well, consider education.
Okay.
When people invest in their education, they don't just benefit themselves.
Right.
It creates positive externalities for society as a whole.
How so?
A more educated workforce leads to increased productivity, innovation, and economic growth.
Well, yeah, that makes sense.
So everyone benefits from a better educated population.
Interesting. So even something as personal as education can have these ripple effects.
It can. And on the flip side, consider the negative externalities of something like social media addiction.
Oh, yeah.
Spending too much time on social media can be bad for your mental health, your productivity, even your sleep.
Right.
And this leads to costs, not just for the individual, but for society as well.
Like healthcare expenses and lost productivity.
Exactly. It's amazing how these externalities, both positive and negative, are woven into so many aspects of our lives.
Yeah, and we're often not even aware of them.
That's true. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these market failures and how they affect us.
I agree.
Understanding them can help us make better choices, advocate for better policies, and ultimately create a more efficient and equitable society.
Well said. But before we get too deep into policy solutions, I want to go back to something we mentioned earlier.
Okay.
The connection between high housing prices and homelessness. It's just heartbreaking to think that something as basic as shelter can become such a problem.
And unfortunately, this problem is often made worse by market forces.
How so?
Well, as demand for housing in desirable areas goes up, developers are incentivized to build more expensive properties.
Because they can make more money that way.
Exactly. They're responding to the demands of the market.
But that leaves people with lower incomes struggling to find affordable options.
Right. And that's where you see that welfare loss we talked about.
Hmm.
It's not just about money. It's about people being priced out of their communities and sometimes even ending up on the streets.
Like the market is failing to provide for everyone's needs.
It is. And that's where the government often steps in with things like rent control, affordable housing subsidies, and investments in public housing.
Trying to create a safety net.
Exactly. They're trying to mitigate the negative consequences of the market and make sure everyone has access to safe and stable housing.
It's a complex problem with no easy solutions.
It is, but understanding how market failures contribute to these problems is the first step towards finding those solutions.
I totally agree. Okay, so we've talked about the market for lemons, looked at some interesting examples of externalities, and even touched on the issue of affordable housing.
We have.
But there's one more real-world scenario I want to explore.
Okay, what's that?
The role of monopoly power.
Monopolies.
I feel like they're often lurking in the shadows, affecting our lives in ways we don't even realize.
That's true. They can be very influential.
So let's shed some light on these monopolies and see how they're impacting everything from the prices we pay to the innovation we experience.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right, so welcome back to the deep dive. We're wrapping up our look at market failures. You know, those times when the invisible hand of the market could use a little help.
Yeah.
But now I think we got to address something kind of tricky. We've been talking about how markets can fail, but what if the thing we're relying on to fix those failures, the government, what if that fails too?
Right. It's like a double whammy.
Yeah, like are we just trading one set of problems for another?
Well, it's not always that straightforward, but it's definitely a risk.
Okay, so let's talk about those risks then. What are some ways that the government can actually make things worse when it tries to fix market failures?
Okay. Well, let's say the government's trying to deal with pollution,
Okay.
and they decide to put strict limits on factory emissions.
Okay, that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, the goal is good, but what if those limits are so strict that companies can't afford to operate anymore?
Right.
They might have to shut down or move their factories somewhere else.
Oh, I see.
And then you end up with job losses in the communities that the policy was supposed to help.
So it's like you're trying to fix one problem and you end up creating a whole new one.
Exactly. It's what we call unintended consequences.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what are some other ways that government intervention can go wrong?
Well, sometimes these interventions can be influenced by special interests.
Oh, yeah, like lobbyists.
Yeah, exactly. Think about industries that lobby for regulations that actually stifle competition and protect their own profits,
Mm-hmm.
even if those regulations hurt consumers or prevent new innovations.
So it's like the government's trying to help, but they're getting bad advice.
Yeah, sometimes it can feel that way.
So how do we make sure the government gets it right? How do we make sure their interventions actually make things better?
That's the million-dollar question, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer.
Okay.
It takes a really careful approach.
Mm-hmm.
We need policies that are well-designed,
Okay.
based on solid data and analysis,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to be flexible and willing to adjust them as we learn more.
So basically, we need to keep our eyes open and be ready to change course if things aren't working.
Yeah, exactly.
It sounds like this whole thing is a delicate balancing act.
It really is. We have to acknowledge the limitations of both markets and governments.
Right, because neither one is perfect.
No, they both have their flaws.
So it's not about blindly trusting one or the other. It's about finding that sweet spot
That point where interventions are effective but not too burdensome.
where they help more than they hurt.
Yeah, exactly.
This makes me think about how important it is for us as citizens to be informed about these issues.
Absolutely.
Because we need to be able to hold our policymakers accountable
Right.
and advocate for solutions that actually benefit everyone.
We can't just sit back and assume someone else is going to fix things.
No, we all have a role to play in shaping the kind of world we want to live in.
Definitely.
So listeners, next time you come across some problem in society, don't just say, oh, that's the market's fault, or oh, that's the government's fault.
Right.
Take a deeper look. Ask yourself, Are market forces at play here? Could the government do something to help? And if so, what kind of intervention would be most effective and most fair?
It's about using that economic lens we've been talking about to understand the forces that shape our world.
Exactly, because once we understand those forces, we can start to change them.
Yeah,
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the world of market
it
failures.
has.
We've learned about the different types, explored some real-world examples, and even grappled with the challenges of government intervention.
It's been a journey.
I hope this has given you all a new perspective, a more critical way of looking at the economic systems that affect our lives.
And as you go about your day, keep an eye out for those market failures, big or small.
Yeah.
What inefficiencies do you notice? What opportunities for improvement do you see? Because it all starts with awareness.
Right, and once we're aware, we can start to make a difference.
Exactly.
So keep those deep diving minds engaged, everyone. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic.
You will.
But until then, happy analyzing.